The gathering shadows. They say history is written by the victors, but in the hills of Pennsylvania, history was written by the missing. On frigid nights when the wind knifes through the trees, locals swear you can still hear the prayers of the lost, carried on the cold air like a chant meant for no living ears. The Whitmore name has long since vanished from family records and church rolls, but if you follow the faint trail through the pines outside Chester County, you'll find a clearing where grass refuses to grow. That is where the Whitmore workshop once stood, a place of sacred craft by day, and something unspeakably darker when night fell. It is here our story begins, in a world of desperate faith, fragile communities, and the seductive promise that holiness might be manufactured, drop by drop, from human suffering. The arrival of the Whitmores, the year was 1742. Chester County was not yet the pastoral picture postcard Pennsylvania we imagine today. It was raw land, rolling hills that gave way to forests so dense the sunlight vanished by mid-afternoon. Farmers hacked fields from stone and bramble, while wolves prowled the edges of homesteads at night. The settlers clung to their faith not as a luxury, but as the only rope keeping them from despair. Nathaniel Whitmore, the patriarch, stepped into this world like a man already chosen by Providence. He was 32, lean, with a deliberate posture that suggested both discipline and concealed arrogance. His gray eyes caught attention quickly. They seemed to look through people rather than at them, measuring, cataloging, and discarding all at once. He introduced himself as a craftsman of sacred objects, and his skill was undeniable. Communion. Chalices with stems twisted like vines, altar boxes whose golden hinges gleamed even in candlelight, and Bible covers so meticulously tooled they appeared alive with motion. The churches wanted beauty. Whitmore provided divinity wrapped in wood and silver. Soon ministers whispered his name across counties, the mask of piety. To neighbors, the Whitmores appeared pious, even exemplary. Elizabeth, Nathaniel's wife, was delicate-featured with a calm so controlled it bordered on unnerving. Nothing rattled her composure, not the cries of her children, not the brutal winters, not even the whispered rumors that the couple's land had been purchased for a fraction of its value after the previous owner's sudden disappearance. Their children mirrored their parents' strangeness in subtle ways. Thomas, the eldest at 16, was solemn and dutiful, a shadow to his father's side. Mary and Sarah, the daughters, moved through the village with polite reserve, avoiding the frivolity of other girls their age. And then there was William, the youngest, a pale, frail boy whose unblinking stare unsettled even the most patient adults. He wandered the woods with a small knife and jars, collecting animal carcasses, pressing herbs into their flesh, and lining them up in neat rows on his windowsill. Most mothers whispered that he was peculiar. Elizabeth only smiled and said her son was destined for serious work. It was a family that inspired admiration and unease in equal measure. The disappearance of Mary Collins, the first true shadow, fell in late autumn of 1745. Mary Collins was no stranger to the community. A Quaker healer, 43 years old, known for walking miles to tend to the sick and poor. That November night, she pulled her cloak tightly around her shoulders against the sting of an early storm. The wind carried the smell of snow and smoke, a reminder that winter was already at the door. She walked the road past the Whitmore property, her lantern swaying. Inside the workshop, light glowed in the windows, though it was long past working hours. The sight might have drawn suspicion, but this was Mary Collins, and she thought little of it. From the shadows stepped Nathaniel himself, lantern in hand, his voice touched with panic. He begged for help. His son, he claimed, had vanished into the woods. William, a frail child, easy prey for wolves. Mary's heart was too kind to doubt him. She followed. She was never seen alive again. The confession of Thomas Whitmore. What became of Mary Collins was not publicly known for decades, but years later, Thomas Whitmore's deathbed confession revealed the truth in agonizing fragments. His words were shaky, inconsistent, as though his hand had trembled with guilt. Father said her saintliness was perfect. He told us God had revealed a purpose, to bring true holiness to these colonies through vessels of sanctity. Behind the workshop's shuttered windows, Mary had been led into a back room prepared with canvas sheets on the floor. Elizabeth had sewn velvet pouches, embroidered with golden crosses. What followed was methodical, carried out not in a frenzy of violence but in cold calculation. Tissue treated with salts, bones wrapped and concealed. A body disassembled as though it were a broken instrument to be repurposed into music. To Nathaniel, this was not murder. This was creation. A new kind of relic for a land desperate to rival the grandeur of European cathedrals. 2 weeks later, he presented the Quaker meeting with a finely crafted altar box in Mary's honor. Sealed within was a fragment of her body. The congregation wept with gratitude, unaware that the woman they mourned now rested in a container of her killer's design. The spread of miracles. By the spring of 1746, rumors traveled faster than rivers. In Philadelphia, an Episcopal church claimed miraculous healings from a relic, a sliver of bone said to come from an ancient martyr. The origin? A dealer in Europe, facilitated by a gifted craftsman in Chester County. That craftsman was Nathaniel Whitmore. The whispers grew, fevers broken, tumors vanished. Parishioners walked without pain. These miracles swelled congregations and lined offering boxes with silver. Ministers competed quietly for Whitmore's favor, praising his artistry while ignoring the foggy provenance of his relics. The Whitmore name became synonymous with divinity, though what seeped from their cellar was anything but divine. The household of secrets. Inside the Whitmore home, the air thickened with secrecy. The daughters began keeping coded journals, half prayer and half confession. Elizabeth trained them in what she called discernment, the ability to recognize those whose bodies would yield the most potent sanctity. She claimed God whispered names to her during prayer. Sometimes she pointed out a frail widow, sometimes a wandering preacher, and sometimes, chillingly, children. The apprentices in the workshop never saw what happened below the trapdoor, though they whispered among themselves. The Whitmores forbade them from entering the cellar, yet the smell that drifted up through the floorboards in winter was not sawdust or varnish. It was sharper, metallic, a smell most men recognized but never dared name aloud. Blood. Foreshadowing. The storm by 1750, the Whitmores' influence stretched across counties. Their artifacts, innocent on the outside, abominable within, rested in churches from Philadelphia to Lancaster. Their wealth grew, their workshop expanded, and still the missing persons continued. The land around Chester County had its explanations ready. Wolves, Indian raids, the hazards of travel. Few wanted to question too closely. To doubt too much was to risk your place in a fragile society that demanded order and faith above all else. But one man would soon begin to question, and questions once asked can never be buried as easily as a body. It was the summer of 1753 when Dr. Samuel Winters of Lancaster held in his hands a relic purchased at great expense by a Presbyterian church. At first glance it was nothing, a finger bone preserved in salt and herbs wrapped in silk. But to a physician's eye, its deception was glaring. The tissue was too fresh, the preservation too crude for something alleged to be centuries old. Dr. Winters closed the reliquary with trembling hands, a cold suspicion settling in his chest. He had no idea that the path he had just stepped onto would not only cost him his life, but drag the Whitmore family into a scrutiny they had evaded for nearly a decade. The Whitmores, for the first time, were being hunted. The anatomy of a lie, the physician's suspicion. When Dr. Samuel Winters examined the supposed relic, he did not expect revelation, only the curiosity of a physician faced with something peculiar. He was a practical man, educated in Edinburgh, trained to see the body not as a vessel of holiness but as bone, sinew, and fragile tissue. Yet as he turned the relic over in his hands, he recognized details too precise to dismiss. The cartilage was not aged and brittle as it should have been, but supple, bearing the faint sheen of preservation. The cut of the bone was too clean, not the jagged irregularity of ancient instruments, but the work of a modern saw. The minister beside him smiled with reverence. "Do you feel it, Doctor? The power that radiates?" Dr. Winters forced a polite nod. He felt something, yes, but it was not power. It was a gnawing terror. Questions that shouldn't be asked in a world where miracles brought hope to hungry congregations. Doubt was unwelcome. Winters' inquiries unsettled more than they enlightened. He visited the church again under pretense of prayer, noting the reliquary's freshness, the way the silk pouch smelled faintly of herbs rather than centuries of incense. He asked where the relic had been purchased. The minister's eyes flickered before naming a craftsman in Chester County. A familiar name. "Whitmore," Winters repeated softly. The syllables tasted wrong. The Whitmore reputation, by then, the Whitmores' name carried weight. Nathaniel was not just a craftsman. He was a man entwined with the religious fabric of the colonies. His workshop supplied communion chalices to Presbyterians, altar boxes to Lutherans, candle holders to Methodists. To accuse him was to accuse the very foundation of faith in Pennsylvania, and yet Winters could not unsee what he had seen. The physician began recording his observations in a journal, noting the cut of bone, the oddities in preservation, the similarity to medical texts he himself studied. He resolved to speak quietly with colleagues, trusted men who would weigh evidence with reason rather than superstition. But the Whitmores were not blind. They had learned to watch for doubt, to sense inquiry like wolves scenting blood on the wind. Elizabeth's discernment, it was Elizabeth Whitmore who noticed first. She always noticed first. While Nathaniel boasted of his expanding commissions and Thomas bent under the weight of his father's expectations, Elizabeth listened. She watched the minister's shifting eyes, the apprentice's unease, and the trembling voice of anyone who asked too much. One night, as snow drifted against the windows of their stone house, she laid a slender hand upon Nathaniel's arm. "My doctor from Lancaster has been speaking too boldly," she said. Nathaniel frowned, his gray eyes narrowing. Winters? A man of reason. He will see nothing but coincidence. Elizabeth's expression did not change. He has already seen more than he should. If he continues, others will follow. Discernment tells me he is dangerous. There was no anger in her tone, no fear, only certainty. The gathering dread Dr. Winters' inquiries did not last long. He disappeared while traveling the road between Lancaster and Philadelphia, his horse found wandering near the river, saddle empty. His journal, careful notes about the Whitmore's relics, was never recovered. Weeks later, a new relic appeared in New York, the finger bone of a healer, complete with a false provenance traced back to medieval Europe. Ministers marveled at the miraculous healings it inspired. Whispers spread, but they were whispers only. Few dared to connect the doctor's vanishing to the Whitmores. Fewer still wanted to. Faith thrived on miracles, not on truths that rotted beneath the surface. The Whitmores had erased their first real threat, the apprentice's unease. In the workshop above the cellar, the apprentices labored at their visible trade. By day, they shaped wood and silver into holy vessels, polishing until their hands cracked. They were never permitted to enter the cellar, but they did not need to. At night, muffled sounds rose through the floorboards, the scrape of metal on bone, the hiss of boiling mixtures, and sometimes, worst of all, the soft cadence of prayer. It was not the prayer of salvation, but of consecration, thanking God for flesh newly sanctified. Jacob Miller, the orphan apprentice, confessed in secret to his companion Peter Collins that he dreamed of hooks dripping with blood. Peter, pale and withdrawn, urged silence. "They watch us," he whispered. "If we speak, we vanish like the others." And so the apprentices worked, silent witnesses to a trade more blasphemous than any heresy. Sarah's journal, meanwhile, Sarah Whitmore, the middle daughter, began to keep her own private record. Unlike her father's ledgers of profit and Elizabeth's notes of discernment, Sarah's journal trembled with guilt. She wrote of her mother's calm cruelty, of William's fascination with preservation, of Thomas's weary obedience. Most hauntingly, she wrote of faces, faces that would not leave her dreams. The children haunt me most. Their eyes are wide, trusting, even as they are led below. I feel their presence when the house is still, as though they linger, asking, why I said nothing. Sarah pressed her words into the page as though each line might bleed her conscience clean, but conscience cannot stay hidden forever. The Whitmore expansion. As the colonies shifted toward revolution, the Whitmore's enterprise flourished. War created scarcity, and scarcity created opportunity. With trade routes disrupted, European relics grew harder to obtain, making Nathaniel's connections all the more valuable. Churches desperate to compete for congregants turned to him with open purses. William, now grown, began experimenting with new methods. He discovered that certain herbs could preserve skin so lifelike that it seemed almost warm to the touch. He spoke with zeal, sketching diagrams late into the night, his hands trembling with eagerness. Elizabeth encouraged him, her voice calm as ever. God has chosen you for refinement, William. Your hands make the saints eternal. To Thomas and Sarah, his fervor was monstrous. To Elizabeth, it was destiny. The first children, it was William who first spoke of children. Innocence, he said one evening, his voice low but insistent. That is the truest vessel. Their purity will yield relics stronger than any widow or preacher. Nathaniel hesitated. Even in his zeal, he sensed a line too dangerous to cross. But Elizabeth silenced his doubt with a single glance. And so, in 1782, the first orphan vanished. A boy of 10, taken from a church asylum in Philadelphia. His disappearance was explained away as a runaway, as so many were. Weeks later, a new relic appeared, the preserved heart of a child martyr. Prayers before it brought miraculous healings of sick children, or so the stories claimed. Attendance swelled, donations overflowed, ministers praised the power of purity. The Whitmores had crossed their final threshold. The unraveling of Sarah. Sarah's journal darkened. William's eyes gleam when he speaks of them. He treats each child as if God himself entrusted the flesh. Father trembles but obeys. Mother watches, calm, her hands steady as she sews the pouches. I feel the house itself groan beneath the weight of what we have done. Her words revealed not only her guilt but her growing fear of William. He spoke now of expanding, of finding more children, of entire limbs preserved for grandeur. Sarah's conscience teetered at the edge of collapse, and yet silence bound her. Still, the investigation begins, but silence could not bind everyone. In 1785, Quaker minister Elijah Thompson was appointed to investigate troubling reports of relic worship spreading among Protestant churches. His notes were meticulous, his logic sharp. He traced threads back to Chester County, back to the Whitmores. He sensed deception in Nathaniel's polished words, inconsistencies in his paperwork. And when Thompson interviewed parishioners who swore to miraculous healings, he noticed a pattern. The same figures appearing across congregations, witnesses, repeating their stories like rehearsed lines. A web was forming, and at its center lay the Whitmores. But the Whitmores sensed him too. One evening, as Thompson prepared his notes by lantern light, he found his documents disturbed, pages missing, ink smudged though the door had been locked. He wrote in his journal, his hand unsteady. I believe I am being watched. Steps behind me at night. A shadow across the window. If this continues, I fear the truth may cost me more than my peace. It may cost my life. Outside, the snow fell, silently across Chester County. In the dark woods beyond his lodging, a figure stood motionless, watching the flicker of his lamp. The Whitmores were preparing to strike again. The breaking point, the watcher. In the dark for weeks, Elijah Thompson convinced himself that the footsteps he heard in the snow were imagination, that the glimmer at the edge of his lantern's circle was merely wind-stirred branches. Yet his unease thickened into certainty. Letters he wrote to trusted colleagues vanished before reaching them. A coded report hidden beneath his mattress reappeared on his desk in the morning, neatly folded as though by unseen hands. He was not imagining it. The Whitmores knew he was circling them, and like a spider with a fly caught on the outermost strand of its web, they were waiting. Still, Thompson pressed on. His Quaker faith gave him no armor but principle, and principle demanded pursuit of truth no matter the cost. A house of prayer and rotten December 8th, 1785, Thompson traveled to the Whitmore estate. The house stood grander now than in earlier years, a two-story structure of timber and stone, windows glowing with warmth. The workshop loomed beside it, larger than many meeting houses, its chimneys coughing black smoke into the winter sky. Nathaniel greeted him with practiced grace. Though illness had thinned his beard and stooped his shoulders, his gray eyes still burned with intelligence. He ushered Thompson into the workshop, showing chalices gleaming on benches, silver etched with crosses and vines. Apprentices hammered, quietly, heads bowed, as though unaware of the tension that pulsed in the air. "You see, minister," Nathaniel said, spreading his arms with feigned humility. "Our work honors God and church alike, sacred vessels for sacred use, nothing more." But Thompson's eyes wandered to the knots in the floorboards where a faint, acrid scent lingered, salt, herbs, and something far less holy. The apprentice's burden that night, while lodging at a nearby inn, Thompson received an unexpected visitor. A young man, face pale as milk, trembling as though from fever. His name was Daniel Foster, one of Nathaniel's trusted apprentices. The boy's words tumbled out in whispers, his voice breaking with every phrase. "They keep us above. Always above. But I saw. I heard." He clutched a small notebook to his chest as though it were his only salvation. "Children, minister, they take children now." Thompson's stomach knotted. He had suspected, but suspicion is not the same as hearing it named aloud. Daniel pressed the notebook into his hands. Inside were hurried entries, dates, initials, faint sketches of surgical tools. Notes about a girl no older than 12, led, below and never returning. The words were desperate, frantic, as though written in stolen minutes under the threat of discovery. "I cannot bear it," Daniel whispered. "If God condemns me for silence, I am lost already." The fire and the river. Thompson promised Daniel protection. He promised testimony would bring the truth into the light. But promises are brittle things when weighed against the Whitmore's reach. Days later, Thompson's rented home in Philadelphia burned. The fire devoured everything: clothes, papers, and most importantly, Daniel's notebook. Thompson himself escaped only because he had been away, meeting with a Quaker elder. Daniel Foster was less fortunate. His body was never found. Only weeks later did fragments surface downstream in the Delaware River. A charred scrap of boot leather, a belt buckle, the kind that apprentices wore. Thompson wrote in his coded journal, "They silence witnesses as easily as they shape wood." The boy's conscience was his undoing, but his words are seared into my mind. I will not forget. I will not forgive. The Whitmores had erased yet another threat, but in doing so, they left Thompson with fury as fuel. Sarah's betrayal inside the Whitmore house. Silence no longer held. Sarah, Elizabeth's second daughter, had begun to splinter. Guilt chewed at her bones, leaking into the pages of her private journal. She wrote of William's manic enthusiasm, of Elizabeth's calm commands, of her father's prayers twisted into justification. By 1787, she could no longer endure it. During a rare trip to Philadelphia, she sought out Elijah Thompson, risking everything. In the back room of a Quaker bookshop, she told him what he already feared and more. She described the cellar in detail, the hooks, the draining vessels, the wooden boxes labeled with names and dates. She drew a map of the workshop, marking the hidden entrance to the chambers below. She told him of a ledger, Elizabeth's ledger, where every victim and every sale was recorded, and when she finished she wept. "I condemn myself with every word," she said, "but the children's eyes haunt me. I cannot bear their silence any longer." A family divided. When Sarah did not return, the Whitmore's house cracked under tension. William raged, his fury cold and calculating. He stalked the study, muttering of betrayal, of punishment. Nathaniel, weakened by illness, muttered scripture about Judas and treachery. Elizabeth remained steady, instructing them to relocate incriminating evidence to the old mine shaft on their land. Thomas, weary and hollow, argued for flight. "We cannot outrun this forever. Let it end before worse comes." But William would not yield. To him, the relics were not crime, but legacy. He would protect them with blood if needed. The descent of the investigators on. February 13, 1788, Elijah Thompson led a small party of constables and Quaker volunteers to the Whitmore estate. Snow drove sideways across the hills, muffling their steps as they approached the workshop. Inside, lanterns burned, though it was late. Thomas Whitmore answered their knock, tall and hollow-eyed, and without protest, invited them in. His calm unnerved them more than resistance would have. When they pressed him, he showed them the trap door. The smell that rose was unbearable, a mixture of chemical sharpness and the sour rot of flesh. Lanterns flickered as they descended into the cellar, where truth could no longer be hidden. What they found would etch itself into memory with scars no prayer could erase. There, beneath the earth, hooks groaned under the weight of 3 bodies. 2 adults and 1 child, skin waxen from preservation, eyes closed as though in uneasy sleep. Along the walls, shelves groaned under hundreds of boxes, each labeled with names, each holding fragments of lives stolen. And on the central table, laid open as though awaiting them, Elizabeth's ledger, every victim accounted for in chilling script. Thompson's hand shook as he turned the pages. Numbers, prices, churches, saints manufactured by murder. But before they could carry evidence to the surface, a scream tore through the storm above. One of the men who had gone to intercept William and Elizabeth stumbled in, blood soaking his shoulder. "They escaped," he gasped. "William fights like the devil himself. And my companion, he is already dead." The Whitmores were not finished. They were loose in the woods, carrying their darkest secrets with them. The night of unholy discovery. The storms cover February 1788 brought a storm so fierce it seemed conjured for the occasion. Snow lashed across the Pennsylvania hills, blinding the eyes, drowning footsteps, muting screams. For Thompson and his small band, the weather was both ally and enemy, concealing their approach but also cloaking the Whitmore's movements. Inside the workshop, the investigators confronted centuries of horror condensed into one cellar. The ledger lay on the table like a throne of guilt, each entry more monstrous than the last. Shelves groaned with boxes of relics, fragments of men, women, and children who had trusted their killers. But William and Elizabeth were not among the captives. They had fled into the storm, dragging trunks of evidence, carrying with them the power to continue their trade, or to vanish, only to begin again elsewhere. The pursuit begins. 2 constables and a Quaker volunteer set out immediately, following tracks through the snow toward the old mine shaft Sarah had described. Lanterns sputtered, nearly extinguished by the wind, but they pressed forward. What they found was chaos. The mine's mouth yawned open, black as a grave, and beside it, a wagon half unloaded. Trunks lay scattered, one cracked open to reveal its obscene cargo, pouches of velvet stitched with gold thread, filled with pale fragments of flesh. And then William emerged from the dark. William unleashed. By now he was no frail boy. 27, sharp-eyed, his body lean with restless energy. He carried no firearm, only a butcher's knife gleaming in the snowlight. He fought with a precision that chilled his pursuers, the knife finding veins and throats as though guided by anatomy charts burned into his mind. One man fell instantly, blood soaking the white snow. Another staggered back with a deep gash to his shoulder. The survivor's account, written later with trembling hand, captured William's frenzy. He did not fight like a man desperate, but like one exultant. Eyes alight, lips moving as though in prayer even as his blade tore flesh. I swear he thanked God with every strike. Elizabeth stood behind him, calm as ever, offering neither panic nor plea. When cornered, she spoke not of mercy, but of barter. "Let us go," she said softly. "We can make you rich, richer than your faith could ever grant. But her words drowned in the snowstorm, lost against William's screams. Collapse of the workshop. Meanwhile, in the cellar, Thompson and the others pressed on. They documented what they could, sketches of hooks, lists from the ledger, hastily written notes of what they had seen. But the storm above pressed urgency into their bones. They could not linger. Thomas Whitmore, left kneeling near the stairwell, began to speak in fragments. Confession spilled from him like water through a broken dam. 79 adults, 22 children, all chosen, all sanctified. Mother could see them, you understand? She said the Spirit showed her. His eyes were hollow, but there was relief in his voice, as though he believed that unburdening his conscience would soften his fate. For Thompson, every word was a blade. He realized the scale was greater than any rumor, any suspicion. This was not simply crime. It was industry. The end of Nathaniel in the main house. They found Nathaniel Whitmore at last. Illness had wasted him, leaving his skin gray, his frame brittle. He did not resist arrest, nor did he beg for forgiveness. Instead, he rambled scripture, plucking verses from memory, weaving them into justifications. The vessels were sanctified, he murmured, staring into the rafters. We gave the colonies what Rome denied them. We made saints from soil. His voice cracked with fever. The mighty patriarch who once convinced ministers of his piety now looked like a withered husk, abandoned even by his own body. They bound him, though it felt unnecessary. His power had passed to Elizabeth and William, now fugitives in the storm. Chased through the pines by dawn, a larger party had gathered. Farmers armed with muskets, constables with clubs, and Quaker volunteers hardened by grim resolve. Together, they pushed into the pine woods, following trails half swallowed by snow. Elizabeth and William moved like wraiths through the forest, but their burden slowed them. Trunks of relics dragged at their sled, leaving furrows easy to follow. Every mile deeper into the wilderness raised the fear that they might vanish entirely, swallowed by the endless expanse. Stories spread quickly among the pursuers, men muttering that William was no longer human, that his knife struck with unholy guidance. Fear gnawed at them, but desperation drove them forward. The cabin in the woods. After 3 days of pursuit, they found the cabin. A hunting shelter, crude and lonely, its chimney cold. Inside, Elizabeth and William lay side by side on a makeshift altar of pine branches. Both were dead, their lips stained dark with poison. But death had not come quietly. The cabin bore signs of ritual. Scripture scrawled across the walls, candles burned down to puddles of wax, relics arranged around the bodies as though awaiting consecration. A letter, written in Elizabeth's steady hand, lay upon William's chest. If the world rejects our work, then we shall sanctify ourselves. In death our flesh will speak more loudly than our lives ever could. The trunks they had carried contained only a fraction of their secrets. Enough, perhaps, to continue the deception elsewhere. Enough to ensure their crimes would ripple long after their deaths. The weight of revelation. The investigators returned with the evidence they could carry: the ledger, fragments from the cellar, the testimony of Thomas and Sarah. But their triumph was bitter. For every relic recovered, dozens more remained in churches across the colonies, venerated by unsuspecting congregations. Thompson wrote in his journal, "We unearthed not merely crime, but blasphemy so vast it corrodes the marrow of faith itself. The people cannot bear to know it. And yet to bury truth is to conspire with it." It was a moral fracture that would haunt him all his days. But the Whitmore's story did not end with their deaths. In the weeks that followed, a new horror emerged. Some churches, when informed of the relic's true nature, surrendered them for burial in unmarked graves. But others, more than Thompson could stomach, refused. They insisted the miracles were real, that God had sanctified the remains despite their origin. They chose deception over disruption, relics over repentance. Thompson stared at the sealed ledger, knowing full well that many of its entries would never be reconciled. And then, late one night, as he worked by candlelight, A knock echoed at his door. When he opened it, no one stood outside. Only a small velvet pouch rested on the step, embroidered in gold, heavy in his palm. He knew without opening it what lay inside. The Whitmores were gone, but their reach was not. The Silence of Saints, a Trial. Without witnesses, April 1788. Philadelphia's courthouse stood under gray skies, its stone walls beaded with rain. Inside, the trial of Thomas Whitmore unfolded behind closed doors. Guards barred the curious, reporters were turned away, and the benches were half empty by design. The authorities feared a scandal too great for the fragile young nation. To admit that ministers had prayed over bones carved from their neighbors, that congregations had bowed before relics birthed from murder, would fracture faith at a moment when America needed unity. So the trial became a muted affair. Thomas confessed, fully describing his father's instructions, his mother's discernment, his brother's grotesque enthusiasms. He spared himself nothing, nor did he spare them. The judge listened, face pale, quill scratching steadily as if recording a nightmare he hoped would dissolve with dawn. When the verdict came, it was swift, death by hanging. On May 7th, 1788, Thomas Whitmore's neck snapped before a crowd who had been told only fragments of the truth. To them, he was a murderer. To history, he was a window into something far more corrosive. The ledger's burden. The true horror lay not in Thomas's words, but in the ledger. Elizabeth Whitmore's meticulous record listed 101 victims. Each entry carried a date, a name when known, and the church that received the relic. Next to every line, a sum of money. Some marked paid in full, others credit pending. To read it was to watch lives transmuted into commerce. A mother's arm traded for altar cloths. A child's rib exchanged for silver chalices. Every victim reduced to a transaction, sanctity measured in shillings. Thompson, staring at its pages by candlelight, felt nausea coil inside him. This was not just murder. This was accountancy in flesh. And yet, after lengthy debate, the authorities sealed the ledger. Its revelations, they claimed, would destroy the faith of good Christians who had prayed sincerely. Better to protect the living than honor the dead. So truth was locked away in silence, the erasure of evidence. The Whitmore property did not survive the year. Officially, a fire consumed the workshop and home, leaving little but charred timber. Unofficially, whispers claimed the blaze had been set deliberately to cleanse the land of its abominations. The surviving relics recovered from the cellar were buried quietly in unmarked graves outside Philadelphia. No hymns were sung, no markers placed. A century later, no one would know the ground held saints born of slaughter. But not all relics were surrendered. Many churches, when told, chose discretion. If miracles came, one minister argued, then surely God sanctified the remains regardless of origin. Others simply feared the financial loss of admitting fraud. Thus, dozens of Whitmore relics remained in use, prayed over, kissed, locked in cabinets of devotion, bones and skin mistaken for holy touch. The cover-up had begun. Sarah's exile, and what of Sarah, the betrayer? Her testimony had made discovery possible, but her survival was a problem. To reveal her role publicly risked unraveling the entire narrative the authorities wished to preserve. So she vanished. Under Quaker protection, she was given a new name and relocated to Boston. There she lived quietly, dedicating herself to orphan charities, pouring her energy into children as though each small kindness could scrub away the faces of those she had failed to save. Her journal continued, filled not with the meticulous guilt of before but with attempts at atonement. She wrote of teaching children letters, of feeding the hungry, of tending to the sick. Yet between these lines, guilt seeped through. I hold their eyes still. No prayer silences them. Every laugh of a child in my care reminds me of those led below. I live, but in truth I walk among ghosts. When she died in 1823, the journal was sealed alongside the other records. Her name, too, was erased. The survivor's dilemma. Elijah Thompson did not escape untouched. Though he survived the poisoning, though he helped bring the truth to light, he carried scars that never healed. His journal entries after 1788 reveal a man hollowed by disgust, not only at the Whitmores, but at the decisions made in the aftermath. We have chosen deception over confession. We bury bones but not lies. Churches knowingly keep what was forged in blood because the miracles are convenient. We are complicit. I wonder if silence itself is the greater sin. He pressed for memorials, for recognition of the victims, but his appeals were quietly denied. His final years were marked by weariness, a man who had stared into the abyss and found his fellow men willing to embrace it rather than recoil. Echoes. Through generations, decades passed. The Whitmore name faded from records, their estate parceled and sold. Yet their legacy lingered in shadows. In 1879, a fire at the Philadelphia courthouse unearthed fragments of Thomas's confession. A reporter pieced together a lurid story, half truth, half embellishment. For a moment, the Whitmores flickered back into public imagination. Churches denounced it as slander, and the story was retracted. But whispers persisted. In 1923, hidden records were discovered in the Historical Society, Thompson's journals, Sarah's confessions, the sealed ledger itself. Scholars studied them quietly, their findings too disturbing for wide publication. By the mid-20th century, surveys confirmed what Thompson had feared. Relics from the Whitmore cellar still existed in churches. Ministers denied, resisted, or ignored the evidence. Faith, once more, proved stronger than truth. The uneasy present. Even in the modern era, their shadow persisted. In 2005, during renovations at a Lutheran church in western Pennsylvania, workers found a velvet pouch hidden in an altar compartment. DNA testing confirmed the remains were human. They were buried quietly in the churchyard, the stone marker, reading only unknown child of God, finally at rest. Yet for every relic discovered, how many remain? How many congregations kneel in prayer before fragments of the murdered, miracles whispered through blood long dried? And so we return to the most chilling legacy, not the Whitmores themselves, but the silence that followed them. A silence chosen, deliberately, woven into the fabric of history, erasing victims so that institutions might remain unblemished. But silence is never perfect. Legends in Chester County still tell of a faint glow in the woods each November 17th, where the workshop once stood. Some swear they hear the creak of hooks, the whisper of prayers, the soft cries of children echoing in the trees. And if you dig deep enough in forgotten archives, you may still find velvet pouches mislabeled, ledgers misfiled, boxes resting on shelves where no one dares open them, because the Whitmores may be gone, but their relics, pieces of their crimes, still breathe in the world, and someone, even now, is keeping count. The Ghosts in the Pews, the Forgotten Ledger in 1923, when the Pennsylvania Historical Society uncovered the hidden compartment containing Elijah Thompson's journals, Sarah's writings, and the Whitmore ledger, the discovery caused quiet uproar among the few permitted to examine it. The ledger was worse than myth, worse than rumor. It was arithmetic in flesh. Every victim tallied, every fragment recorded. To close the book was to feel the weight of dozens of erased lives pressing against the heart. But rather than publish the findings, the society did what others had done before. It sealed them. A new catalog entry disguised the contents as ecclesiastical correspondence. A century of silence followed. Scholars whispered of the ledger, citing fragments in obscure footnotes, but never naming it directly. And so, like the Whitmores themselves, the record of their deeds survived not in memory but in shadow. The ruins that would not rest. The Whitmore property changed hands countless times. Farmers tried to till its soil, only to find crops withered unnaturally in the fields where the workshop once stood. Shepherds claimed their flocks refused to graze there, bleeding in agitation whenever driven too near. By the 1930s, the land was abandoned, left to weeds and silence. Local children dared one another to approach the ruins, whispering of faint hammering sounds drifting from beneath the ground, of ghostly lights weaving through the trees each November. Old men muttered that the Whitmore's work was not truly ended. That hook still swung below, empty yet waiting. The Scholar's Dilemma, in 1967, a discreet survey identified 11 churches across the eastern United States that still possessed relics matching the ledger's descriptions. When researchers quietly informed the clergy, reactions varied. Some recoiled in horror, surrendering the objects for burial. Others refused outright, insisting miracles had occurred and must not be denied. One pastor, when pressed, simply asked, "If a child's relic healed another child, was it not sanctified in the end? Does not God redeem even the darkest vessel?" The question was never answered. It lingered like a rot in the bones of history. The uneasy present by the dawn of the 21st century, the Whitmore story was little more than a footnote, rumored, dismissed, hidden in dusty archives. But traces remained. In 2005, renovation workers at a small Lutheran church discovered a hidden velvet pouch behind the altar, its contents tested and confirmed as human tissue. It was buried quietly, marked only as unknown child of God. But for every pouch discovered, how many remain? For every relic destroyed, how many are kissed, prayed over, and wept upon by the faithful, unaware that they cradle the flesh of murdered innocents? The Whitmores are gone, but their victims endure, divided, scattered, sanctified by lies. A question of belief, perhaps the most chilling legacy of the Whitmores, is not the relics themselves, but the miracles. Reports of healings, visions, and answered prayers followed their relics like shadows. Some can be dismissed as hysteria, suggestion, coincidence, but others defy explanation. Incidents recorded by sober witnesses with no knowledge of the relic's origins, which leaves a question as disturbing as it is unanswerable. Can faith itself transform the profane into the holy? Can murder become miracle if enough believe it so? If so, then perhaps the Whitmores were not only killers. Perhaps they were accidental alchemists, transforming flesh into faith, lies into power, and if that is true, then their influence may never truly have ended. The final unearthing in 1992, ground-penetrating radar surveyed the old Whitmore property. Beneath the soil, anomalies matched the descriptions of the underground chambers. The landowners, disturbed by what was revealed, refused further excavation. The ground was resealed, the site marked as historically significant but closed to the public. But workers who were there swore of something else, that when their drills broke through the old timbers, a foul odor seeped upward, sharp with salt and herbs, though nearly 2 centuries had passed. And in the silence that followed, one man claimed he heard chains clink in the darkness below, faint but deliberate. The chambers had been filled, yes, but perhaps not emptied. The modern whisper, which brings us to the present. In 2019, a church in Maryland discovered a hidden reliquary during renovations, containing bones wrapped in Whitmore-style velvet. The find was not publicized. Instead, it was quietly removed, tested, and returned without announcement. The pastor who oversaw the decision told a local historian, "It is better that the faithful never know." And so the cycle continues. Concealment, silence, prayer whispered, over flesh that never consented to be holy. The Whitmores may have died in 1788, but their enterprise lingers, not in their hands, but in the rituals of those who still venerate their work, knowingly or not. The last word of Sarah Whitmore Sarah's journal, discovered with Thompson's papers, ends with words so stark they read like prophecy. "We stole not only lives but memory. We severed bodies and scattered them like seed, until no grave could ever hold them whole. And so they will never rest, not in this world nor the next. Their fragments lie in pews, in altars, in cabinets of prayer. Each prayer awakens them. Each kiss stirs them. They are not gone. They are divided." She ends with a single line, scrawled in a trembling hand. "And scattered saints cannot forgive." So the next time you enter an old church and see a reliquary gleaming in the candlelight, ask yourself, whose bones are you bowing to? Whose skin rests beneath the velvet? Is it a saint? Or is it a victim, taken centuries ago, their identity erased so thoroughly that even in death they serve a lie? And when you kneel, when you whisper a prayer into that silence, are you speaking to God? Or are you feeding the memory of the Whitmores, craftsmen who turned murder into devotion, who carved eternity from human bone, and whose shadows still linger in the pews of America's oldest churches? The Whitmores are dead, but saints still wait in the dark.